Okay, so both Dr. Swindal and I have prepared texts. Mine will take about 12 to 15 minutes to read, and I think Dr. Swindal's is about the same length. I'll go first, then he'll go. And then I'll take 5 minutes just ad lib to respond to his text, and he'll take about 5 minutes to ad lib respond to my text, or maybe what I've said in response to his. Then we're done, and we'll open it up for question and answer.
Good.
So roughly 30 to 40 minutes of us talking, and then the rest, which could be as much as an hour, taking questions. Okay, so I guess, should I go then?
Yeah, if you'd like to get started then, sure. I'm gonna pin your video.
Okay. So I'm gonna read this text, which I've never done into a Zoom meeting before. I feel like this is an Oval Office address or something. I'll try and discipline myself to look at the camera. All right, our question, is free speech good? The quick answer is yes. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. By here, I mean three things. One, at a debate. Two, in a university. And three, in a liberal democratic society. I'll consider the first in most detail because I see the second and third as large-scale versions of the first. Towards the end, I'll try to explain why. But let me begin first with a debate. Imagine a debate in which at least one of the speakers was not free to speak as he saw fit. That is, he was not free to make what he considered his best arguments in the way he considered most clear and sound. Maybe those ways of speaking have been forbidden by official policies, rules, or laws. Maybe they have simply been proscribed by norms, customs, or conventions. It doesn't matter. If there are punishments or costs of any kind for speaking freely, and they are severe enough to deter at least one of the speakers from doing so, it wouldn't be a real debate. It's not hard to conjure such a case, especially from the past. How about the debate between Socrates and a priest of ancient Athens about piety, such as we read in Plato's Euthyphro? We don't share the religion of ancient Athens, so it's easy for us to miss the political significance of that debate. But Socrates was put to death by the Athenians for speaking so freely about such matters. They deemed him blasphemous. But fortunately for us, he cared more about the pursuit of truth than his reputation, or ultimately his life. What a brave man. For anyone less brave, nervous to contradict a priest in public, afraid to go against the prevailing religion, jealous of his property, liberty, or life, the discussion with Euthyphro would not have been a real debate. It would have been a few bland questions and more polite nods. Historical examples are easy because we look at them from the outside. None of us worships Zeus, so it's easy to side with Socrates. More free speech, fewer blasphemy laws. Who disagrees with that? But this shouldn't be easy, otherwise we won't know what's at stake. Take something present, here, now, something we're in. There is an official religion at Duquesne, Catholicism. But I don't think it plays anything like the role that Athenian religion played in Socrates' lifetime. After all, I've heard many professors speak ill of the church and its doctrines, publicly, without any consequences. If anything, they win the esteem of their colleagues. But say a word against the prevailing doctrines of race and gender, and you immediately become persona non grata. Accordingly, those doctrines are much better approximations of Athenian religion when it comes to the risk of free speech. This is not a coincidence. As secularization accelerates, new religions are filling the void left by traditional religions. Something has to give structure and purpose to our beliefs, actions, and relationships. Egalitarianism is one of the most powerful new candidates. In environments where it prevails, such as the university, there can be no real debate about its doctrines, unless someone were willing to play Socrates and suffer the consequences. Consider what a debate is. Some people think it's a battle of words. In this popular conception, debate as disputation, each person takes a side and tries to score points for her side. The one who gets applause or votes or makes the sickest burn, however victory is measured, wins. The one who doesn't loses. Often it's a draw, for interesting psychological reasons that are not our concern today. But whatever happens in such a debate, it's not a real one. at least in my estimation. It can be entertaining, like sport or reality TV, but truth is rarely served and almost never disseminated in those ways. A real debate, which Plato calls dialectic, happens when a group of people pursue the truth together. Sometimes one person speaks on behalf of one side, another on the other, and an audience listens to their arguments, weighing them up, ideally after a question period, to try to determine together where the truth lies. It's an effective method for seeking and disseminating the truth. It's not the only such method, to be sure, but it's one of the best, tested over millennia in the East and the West. It simply doesn't work, however, when one or more of the participants cannot speak freely. This was understood even by the Catholic Church, the same institution that gave us the Inquisition, the trial of Galileo, and the burning of heretics at the stake. For the Church instituted the avocatus diaboli, or devil's advocate, as insurance against confusing the truth with a comfortable consensus. Egalitarianism has not yet produced blasphemy laws with such serious consequences, at least not yet. But neither has it instituted anything like a devil's advocate. To be a devil's advocate in the eyes of orthodox egalitarians is to be a devil. Why? Well, I think it's complex, and I've published an essay on this for anyone interested. But in short, disputation doesn't need freedom of speech. Imagine yourself as a contestant in a battle of words. If one route to victory is blocked, try another. You're not allowed to insult the opponent? Okay, flatter the audience instead. Since winning depends on their approval, it's a better strategy anyway. You're not allowed to ask a question, let alone state a thesis that the audience will find offensive? Good to know. Your goal is popularity, so of course you won't ask that question or state that thesis. Just skip it. The goal is winning, and there are many paths to the top of that mountain. Contrast this disputatious approach to words with the approach of a dialectician, a practitioner of real debate, as I understand it. When your goal is truth, if there are words that you deem important to its pursuit, yet the audience finds offensive, you have a stark choice. Use those words and lose your audience, along with other things like your job in some cases, or censor yourself to stay popular, or at least employed. Here is another way of putting the choice. Have a real debate or not. So we're here at a debate. If we want it to be real, we think free speech is good. Indeed, it's necessary. That was the first thing I meant by here. Let me quickly discuss the other two things I meant, a university and a liberal democratic society. A university. Why are we here? What's the purpose of a university? As I've argued elsewhere, it's the same as the purpose of a debate, to seek and disseminate the truth. That's because a university is just one giant debate. You might be forgiven for thinking otherwise after surveying today's universities. Even when they claim to pursue truth, most of them show by their decisions that they prefer other goals instead, whether it's money, prestige, social justice, the glory of athletic victory, you name it. This is the main reason why universities are in crisis. Of course, there are many other reasons: the pandemic, the looming depression, the growing superstition of our national culture. But the main reason universities are in crisis is that they have lost their way. For people interested primarily in those other goals, there are far more honest and efficient ways to achieve them than to pretend to pursue and disseminate truth. And you can pretend to have a real university, just as you can pretend to have a real debate. For that pretense, free speech will not be necessary. You can limit your investigations to the topics that make no one upset, but then you are not really pursuing truth. You're cooperating the illusion that this is what universities are still about. And you can teach in a way that offends no one, but then you are not really disseminating truth. You're cooperating in the illusion that this is education. If you care about truth, and thus real debate and real universities, you're going to need to be able to speak freely. Finally, we're here in a liberal democratic society, for the present anyway. What is its purpose? Some say freedom, others equality. Both are wrong in my view. I think the liberal democratic ideal is faltering now because the contradictions in those conceptions of its purpose, which have been evident to philosophers since its inception, are becoming evident to everyone. As I read on a fortune cookie when I was in college, the philosophy of one century becomes the common sense of the next. So if the purpose of liberal democratic society is not freedom or equality, what is it? Perhaps by now you won't be surprised to hear that I believe it to be the same as that of the university and the same as that of debate, namely the pursuit and dissemination of truth. Only so, I have argued more fully in my published work, can we warrant its basic rights: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and so on. That's because these rights are essential to the achievement of its purpose, namely truth. Between a liberal democracy such as the USA and a debate such as we're having now, I believe it's merely a difference in scale. So let's focus on this debate. My argument is quite simple. To repeat, if either I or my opponent cannot speak freely, this is not a real debate, but a travesty, a sport, a disputation. So which is it? I'm not going to say what I think, which isn't to say I don't find that an interesting question or that I don't have an answer, but it's a political question, a sociological question, perhaps even a psychological question. Do we have real debates nowadays? Is this one of them? Whatever you want to call them, those aren't philosophical questions. My task today is to defend an answer to a philosophical question. Is free speech good? I think it is because I believe that truth is good and that free speech is necessary to seek and disseminate it. What about you? What I hope to have made clearer for you is whether you think free speech is good. If you've come here for a real debate, a dialectic rather than a disputation, I hope to have shown you that you too think freedom of speech is good. I'm guessing you do. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here. Unless, of course, you came for some theater. If so, you've made a mistake. We philosophers are not good actors. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Miller. If Dr. Swindal would like to now give his introduction.
Okay, very good. Tough act to follow there. But quickly, I just want to again thank the Duquesne University Philosophy Society for bringing this to happen, and for Dr. Miller, who is painstakingly good at arranging such things and participating. Okay, so again, I'm reading this to you. Concept of free speech emerges early in our lives. Most all of us have an intuitive sense of speaking, and especially of being heard, in the sense of being listened to so as to be understood. So I see free speech as connected to the obligation of listening to free speech. Such is natural, I would say, beginning in our earliest years in the family environment. Although wanting to say anything you want at any time without restraint is one thing, actually having the speech heard is entirely another, of course. Yet, as I'm saying, the two have to go together, as we'll see. One must want to be heard to speak out. If one is intentionally just speaking out for no reason, it is not to be considered speech at all. Just want to be clear from that, on that from the outset. Speech and hearing go together. Also, importantly, speaking out and free speech is, in my definition, not always just verbal. Free speech can involve gestures, as we well know, or even expressive images of ourselves and others that we present. In my definition, it is whatever is supposed to be heard as well as seen. Any form of self-expression, in other words, is involved in free speech. Right off the bat, what does the Bible say about what would be problematic speech or not free speech? There were prohibitions on gossip, to be sure, and Jesus did more than once command his disciples not to speak about his healings. So Jesus himself restricted speech at certain times. Jesus affirmed that, quote, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Matthew 12. Then we have St. Paul's injunctions, quote, "But now you must put them all away, anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth," unquote. That's Corinthians 3:8. And further, quote, "For I'm afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be," very Pauline, "and you may not find me as you want me to be. I fear there may be discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition," the two that I think are important here, slander and gossip. And that's Paul's letter to the Corinthians whom he was talking to. So there's no question that there were restrictions on these self-expressions through speech through time. I just give the biblical as an example. Okay, now to the analysis. Our socialization through life assumes the same dynamic that began in the family for us. There are, of course, times and places for speaking, but under reasonable conditions that we assume the allowance of free speech to be given. And those times and places where it may occur are often disputed. Let me consider some. First, let's consider the academic or school setting. Starting out in our early years in school. Now, they are not exactly the best places to consider free speech since they are so unique and restricted as a speaking space, even in higher education. Can't tolerate certain things that students say in a classroom that are completely irrelevant. They have the freedom to say that, but I equally have the obligation to rule out certain discourse that is not appropriate to a class. Okay, so that's just on a superficial level, but real. There's certain times that certain speech is not allowable. Okay. Then we have the workplace. What about free speech in the workplace? Like a school, it is an unusual space because of the restrictions that are quite unique to it. Free speech can, in a workplace, can technically engender the safety or endanger the safety, let alone employment of oneself and others. So that's kind of a unique zone for free speech in the workplace. Without going through all the other places that would have their speech restrictions, such as those in social media and the press, suffice it to say that we consider free speech primarily, this is what I will be doing here, a political issue, closely tied to the First Amendment right to assembly. Also tied to that, it's a First Amendment right, of course. Let's say that the paradigmatic case free speech protects is to speak out not only against injustice per se, but something more basic. We'll talk about that more basic thing below. So let me give my working definition now. Free speech is the moral precept to allow speakers to express their thoughts, not just reasoned judgments, in certain, mostly political environments, in order to be heard and responded to. So those are the elements I think are essential. As you can see, I've shifted this from a political to a moral issue. Though remaining underdefined, the moral places is a more basic issue than one could analyze exceptions to be made than would be all the areas of political intricacies and variations. So I'll focus on the morality of free expression is really what it comes down to. So given this definition, I shall do three things in the time that remains. One, give a brief description of the political grounds of free speech. Secondly, give Stanley Fish's account of free speech. And third, develop a way of moving beyond what we currently understand of free speech in this moral way. So part one. Politics still seems the proper area to talk about free speech. Consider, of course, the First Amendment. Here I'll quote it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceable assembly and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. First Amendment. Presumably the key issue here involves speaking out against laws or policies. That's the free speech right you have. But immediately emerged a bevy of problematic cases, such as the free expression of problematic images, pornographic or violent, against sexist and racist language, hate speech, slander and libel, or even threats of violence. These areas seem to demand restrictions, even politically. And there are many, and in a way right now, many more. Think of an incident here recently at Duquesne regarding restricted speech. Would democracy allow a serious discussion of whether the Holocaust happened? I'll just leave that. Okay. So, where actually does the political right of free speech come from? Well, it needs to be based, I think it is based, on a distinction between speech and action. The First Amendment gives no allowance of free action. You can't do whatever you want. You might be able to say whatever you want in certain political situations, but you can't act in any way you want. There's no freedom of action in that sense. This distinction assumes then that problematic speech is less damaging than problematic action. For example, murder being an action and speech saying I'm going to murder somebody versus actually going out and murdering them. This distinction, though, could be the stuff of a much longer debate. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that. The distinction between speech and action, I think, is mirrored on the moral problem of differentiating extrinsic acts from intrinsic intentions. An intention is like, and I'm going to make this claim, making an intention to do something is like an internal act of speech. That's an intention desire. Now, it often comes up, is one acting just with an unspoken intention? Can you be, in a certain sense, therefore criticized for just an intention that you don't act on? For internal speech that you don't act on? The biblical answer is yes. Consider the 10th commandment, prohibition of coveting not only thy neighbor's goods or thy neighbor's wife. Now, a neighbor's wife could also be considered a good in those biblical times, but there is a distinction between those two kinds of coveting. Let's remember that coveting is an intentional and thus mental act, effectively hidden from all other actions that are external. But this moral issue does not impact political speech, it seems, which does not make the link between speech and action. Although in some courts of law, you can be punished for planning a murder that you didn't carry out. But my main point here is that we've got to link speech and action, because internal speech can admit an action, but it still can have consequences even if it's not acted on. We also have to remember that free speech is bookended by the right also not to speak at all. The Miranda warning reminds us that we have the freedom or right to remain silent after all. Fifth Amendment's right not to incriminate yourself. Our question then, based on this, is whether the freedom of speech would ever entail the obligation to speak. It's kind of a whole other question. Free speech and obligatory speech is another question that arises. We've already pointed out this problem relative to the freedom not to listen to speech. We also have the freedom not to listen to speech. What if that were an obligation? Very interesting kind of speculation. Yeah. Okay, here's my main point here in this part one. The last very problematic thing about free speech in the political sense is that it includes, as we well know in our current climate, the freedom to lie. We allow the freedom to lie. The First Amendment, as it's written, allows the freedom to lie. You can have speech that's completely false and is protected, at least in generic. This includes the intent to get the lie recognized. That's also something that is a fact. Presumably there are slander and libel laws against that kind of false speech, but ordinarily, especially in the realm of media, there are few sanctions against lying. Yet there are moral sanctions against lying. This is why we need to switch to the moral realm, I think, to make full sense of the issue of free speech. As you can imagine, this is where I will say there should be moral restrictions on speech and expression. There is no moral freedom or right to speak a lie. Part 2. Stanley Fish, currently at Cardozo Law School and formerly the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he was, I think, when he wrote this material. Fish is arguably the best known, that doesn't mean the best overall, but the best known philosophical argument on free speech in recent times, I think. This is 1994, he wrote it. It has a rather tendentious title, quote, "There is no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing too," unquote. That's the title of this piece. It was first a lecture he gave, and then it was later published by Oxford. In chapter 8, Fish gives a celebrated example of the poet John Milton, who is a well-known, let's say, early adherent of free speech in his Areopagitica. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. That was the work, it was him. It was primarily meant to be a bulwark against the practice in his time of pre-publication censorship. Milton does provide an exception, though, for ostensibly free speech that needs what he calls exclusion. For him, the exclusion would include, interestingly, the speech of, quote, popery and superstition, unquote. So that was this kind of polemic against the Catholic Church, which was exactly, had been practicing this pre-publication censorship. Drawing from this, Fish surprisingly sounds like Agamben of our own age, saying that in fact, quote, all values are constituted by an act of exclusion, unquote. I think Agamben had read Milton perhaps when he went into that famous article of his. Freedom of speech has never been general, as Milton himself concluded, with his exceptions with regard to Catholicism, but has always been formed by original act of exclusion that gives it meaning. Okay. Fish does move to what he considers not a general law-based regulation, but a, quote, pragmatic one. Like much of his argument is basically pragmatic. Pragmatically, you need to have exceptions to freedom of speech. He does realize that allowance for rights to free speech can slow down outcomes in cases in which over hasty outcomes, he says, emerge where abuses of power have been prevalent. So I think he was saying in the situation right now, Black Lives Matter, it's bound to be difficult to express free speech when you're in a minority, for example. And pragmatically, you have to take account of the problems there. The bottom line for Fish is that, quote, speech really matters, unquote, but that it develops over time such as no restrictions at a given time are ever prima facie unreasonable. So the ideal of free speech seems to be there for Fish, but where we are right now, it's just not going to work without some restrictions. Fish concludes that we have to remember that the very political forces that allow free speech often do so on the basis of apolitical abstractions. Because the concept, right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we're using the abstraction of liberty, perhaps in the early constitutional times of the US, to then have liberty of speech. That's what he's getting at, but that's an abstraction. So the realization of this involves the grasp of what's called a performative contradiction. What we are asking for in today's freedom of speech is actually an unrealizable conceptual impossibility because of our context. It's kind of a weird argument, but he's just saying free speech is just not realistic right now and therefore should be restricted at times. politics pushes freedoms based on what can and then should be realized in politics only free of ideology. And we aren't there yet. We aren't in a politics free of ideology. Why should we, he says somewhat tendentiously, why should we have to court even our own deaths with the freedoms to live for following of an abstraction? That's kind of like Karl Marx. There cannot be free speech because there is no public space free of ideology. Okay, so that's basically Fisch's argument. Now I'll give my conclusions very briefly. What is the upshot here? Effectively, it is that speech is an action, and just as actions have restrictions, so speech should have some restrictions. I realize that speech might be the unique action that shouldn't have any restrictions. Although, according to Dr. Miller's kinds of ways of looking at it, I see that could be the case, that speech is unique as an action. Nonetheless, Fisch has given us a conceptual argument. You cannot have free speech with ideological abstractions interpreting it and enforcing it. And that is what we currently have. But my further entailment is that without these abstractions, it would have to be completely reconfigured as speech, if not indeed made moot. If we had no abstractions to draw resources on, what would we be speaking about at all in the sense of truth? But I won't go too far. I respond by the fact that the prohibition against lying is what makes speech even possible. And without it, all would be moot. So without the possibility of speech being false, that would make speech rather useless. So it's a weird tension between the fact that free speech would have the possibility of being false, but certainly not the intention of being false. The biggest problem of rejecting free speech, especially thinking against the social grain, as it were, would be how would you enforce it? I just want to pass on that problem. I can't imagine myself saying there's no more free speech, or that if you lied during a speech, you'd have to be punished from doing that. I just want to take on that issue, which would be a huge issue. If all of a sudden we didn't have free speech anymore, I'm not looking at the practicalities of that. I'm just doing it from a moral point of view. Regardless of this is my last sentence here, my final take is that the reality, not the abstraction, that grounds speech is that speech is meant to communicate either truths or neutral states of affairs, such as probabilities, but not falsehoods. There's no right to express a falsehood. To reiterate, politically, we do not have effectively the freedom to lie, but from a moral point of view, we do have the freedom to lie politically, but not morally. So that's my conclusion.
Thanks, Jim. So there's a lot for me to respond to in that, and I, like you, am eager, I assume, to get to questions, but I'll pick one point that I would contest, and that's the part about speech and acts being the same thing. In other words, Stanley Fisch's argument. The way that I'd put it in the terms of my text, and I'll try to bring our text together on this point in a moment, but the way I'd put it in terms of my text is that I distinguish between disputation and dialectic. So my basic argument was, if we're going to have a real debate, there has to be freedom of speech. And then I defined a real debate as dialectic, which is to say a group of people in good faith pursuing the truth, offering competing reasons, making objections, and so on. And that's different from disputation, where I've got a side, you've got a side, and I'm trying to win, you're trying to defeat me, and victory is defined different for different groups according to, the culture of the particular group. So my argument depends on there being a distinction between disputation and dialectic, or between mere debate and real debate. And Fisch denies that there's any such distinction. Fisch thinks there's no such thing as dialectic. Everything is disputation. You know that, I know that because we're familiar with Fish, but I'll say, especially to the undergraduates, that Stanley Fish is self-consciously working in a tradition from ancient Greece called sophistry, the ancient Greek sophists. And one quick way into Plato's philosophy is that Plato's defining himself against the sophists. So I gave roughly a Platonic account of speech, and Stanley Fish gives a sophistic account of speech. So it's no surprise that they're opposed to each other. So let me just say a few words about the Greek sophists, and then I'll tie it to this particular debate. So my favorite Greek sophist is Gorgias. He wrote a speech in praise of Helen. Helen was the daughter of a god who was married to Menelaus. And Paris, the Trojan prince, visited Menelaus's castle, and then in the middle of the night he left with Menelaus's wife, Helen, went back to Troy. And Menelaus gathered an army and went and attacked Troy. And what you get is what's depicted in the Iliad, namely this 10-year war outside the walls of Troy to get Helen back. So Helen was sort of like the Eve of the Greeks, namely here was the woman who sailed 1,000 ships. She was considered, the cause of this terrible war in their mythology. And Gorgias wrote a speech in praise of Helen. So that would be as audacious as going to Congress and writing a speech in praise of Osama bin Laden. That would be like arguing that the Holocaust didn't happen. That would be like interviewing David Duke on 60 Minutes, the various examples that you use. In other words, an extremely audacious political gesture. The thing is, Gorgias didn't really believe that Helen was innocent. He was just trying to show that he could prove any case. He was so good a speaker that he made that speech to say, if I can persuade you of this, then you'll believe anything. But he wasn't trying to just manipulate people. He was advertising his skills as a speaker. Because after that speech, if people thought, wow, Helen was innocent, but all my life I've lived as if she were, a devil, well, I'm going to pay this guy to teach me how to speak. Because that's very important in democracies, especially a radical democracy like Athens, where everybody, in principle, can speak in the assembly. More importantly, in courts, you had to defend yourself. There weren't lawyers. So that's why everybody had to speak well. So at any rate, Gorgias gives this speech for which we have the text. And he's got a fourfold argument that she's innocent. And I won't go through all the details, but he says, either she was taken away by force, raped, or she fell in love, but love, eros, is a goddess, or a god, excuse me, and so she had no control. So she had no control if she was raped. She had no control if she was taken away by or influenced by a goddess. Maybe it was her fate, and they believe that the fates were gods, so that's pretty much the same argument. Or, this is the interesting thing, she was persuaded by Paris's speech. And Gorgias then talks about the effects of speech and the nature of speech. His account of speech is that, as Dr. Swindal said on behalf of Stanley Fish, speech is action, that there's no difference. So there's no difference then, but in principle, between me pushing you in the face with my hand and me speaking to you. When I push you with my hand, that has an immediate effect on you. There's no difference in that effect based on how you think about it. Whereas I think, Plato thinks, advocates of free speech typically think, there's a difference between me hitting you in the face with my hand and me speaking, because my words go into your mind and you can then choose how to deal with them. When you get hit in the face, there's no choice. There's a choice of how to react, but there's no choice about how your forehead's going to respond to the hit in the face. By contrast with words, we can take them in and they don't have to affect us. We can, first of all, question, what does this mean? And then when we decide what it means, we can then question, is this true or not? Such that if it's true, all right, then I'm going to believe it. The way I put it in one of my articles is that we have like containers in our mind. And when we hear speeches, we can put the speeches into the containers. They're not affecting us necessarily, so long as they stay in the containers. Here I've got a speech, let's say Gorgias' speech about Helen. I put it in a container. I can ask all kinds of questions. What does it mean? And then once I figure I know what it means, then I can start asking, is it true? And if I decide that it's true, then okay, maybe I'll come out believing that Helen was innocent or not. Or maybe I'll decide this is a meaningless speech, or there are a bunch of false claims, or this is fallacious, so I'm not going to believe it. So there's that special feature of speech that we have control over how we take up speeches, but we don't have control over how we take up acts. Demonstrated again by being hit in the face. You can control what you do after an act, but the act itself, the effect that it will have on you, the physical impact, that's not something that you can control. So there's a lot more to be said, but that I think Fish, using that sophistic tradition, makes a fundamental mistake when he says that speeches are just acts, that there's no difference. I think there is a difference, and the difference is that we can decide freely how to take up speech, whereas we can't do the same with acts.
Good. Okay. So, good. My response is, first of all, Dr. Mill and I, unfortunately, agree on way too much here. So I have to kind of dig down to get to something where I think we can have a more fruitful prompting of the questions here. Because certainly the way that you've described the Athenian, let's say, tradition of democracy and the freedom of speech is part of that. And with the dialectics, and not the disputation as such, that's all, I certainly affirm all of that all the way through. But it is ultimately a dialectics. But here's where I think you and I differ a bit. Not so much differ, but just different perspectives. But you point out rightly that if you say something bad to someone, that's a lot different than hitting them. Quite simply.
Yes.
You can choose to not listen. This is what I was so into, hearing and listening. Mm-hmm. The freedom of speech has the freedom not to listen, not to hear. That's the implicit thing. We do not have to listen to people, even though it's probably people's primary frustration when their free speech is not heard. But that's another issue entirely. But given that, there does, I grant your point there in a kind of physical sense, certainly, that action can be much more ostensibly injurious than speech. However, one can point out where there are people who take certain words used by certain people in certain contexts, just the words, to be terribly damaging. And a lot of speech is very violent. We know this. They're just factoids, but of course, I'm not undermining the basic point there. But it is amazing how some people are good at filtering out speech that can be injurious or harmful, and people who can't filter it out for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. Versus people who like some kinds of actions that seem to be quasi-violent. We can talk about different people's valence for fighting, boxing, or whatever else. So there's some textures of that distinction that I'm just pointing out there. But mine is something I didn't mention too much in my thoughts there was, is kind of a logical or an argumentative distinction between speech and action. And it's this, that speech are like premises, right? When you speak, you're really building sentences, to say something is usually able to be translated to a sentence. I say hello to you, I'm saying really I'm greeting you, right? So I have free speech to say hello to you, but there's always kind of a content that's implicit, even in single words, that those form premises. Premises for what? A conclusion, all right? Now, in rationality, we're all trying to get to what? Not premises, we're all trying to get to conclusions. So if I'm given false free speech, I am trying to form a premise, which is innocent as being a premise, it's just a premise. But when I therefore build it into a conclusion, my conclusion is unsound because I've been given free speech that I'm taking to be a premise that's false, and that there's no restriction on it. the social media tells me something, I can take that as a premise to make, which are innocent, but they go towards conclusions which are, therefore, where actions start. There's no action, human action, that is not a conclusion to a deliberation. So I'm saying that's another connection between speech and action. Speech is like premises for conclusion. Conclusions are the action. Speech is like a pre-action. And that's where the problematic things come. I have a responsibility not to just give people conclusions by my actions physical to them, but to give them truth through my speech by which they can form premises to make conclusions on the basis of which actions lie. Okay.
So should we take questions from the audience? Thank you, Joe.
I have a question.
Please.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, sorry, I was just waiting for permission to speak. I wanted to point out that I think we have to come to a consensus in this debate to what free speech is per se. Well, what would Dr. Miller say free speech is?
You're right. I didn't give a definition. I don't really like definitions. I find that there are usually more exceptions to them than there are clarity achieved by them.
Because the only I was going to say, it seems to me, this is just, and I agree with your understanding about definitions, but it seems to me that Dr. Swindal may have taken this to mean that there are no restrictions of speech in society, when in fact there are several court cases I could name. Miller versus California, which outlawed child pornography in the 70s, Snick v. United States, and Brandenburg versus Ohio. And I think even enshrined in our Constitution, the First Amendment does not give a license to say whatever we want. The written Schneck versus United States, we hear the famous line in Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s opinion, you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. So I'm confused as to what we are actually talking about. And if this does have merit, because there does seem to be a limit on what we can say, albeit a small limit. Now, we can see that being expanded on the universities and in the political spheres, if we allow hate speech or should not allow hate speech. However, on our very basis where we are today, we do not have a license to say whatever we want.
Right. Yeah, so I do actually have an interest in defining speech. I think that's, that's in the end for me what this is about. What is speech and what is it for? I think it's for truth. And so the notion of free speech that I'm defending comes out of that understanding of what speech is. Since speech is for truth, then we should be allowed to speak freely because that's the whole point of speaking in the first place. But there are other concerns in life as well, like safety. So that if somebody's speech in a crowded theater is fire, that's, first of all, not aimed towards truth. It's a lie, as Dr. Swindal was emphasizing at the end of his talk, but it also is going to threaten people's lives because of a stampede. So I agree with you, there are going to be restrictions. It's not like anybody can say whatever they want in any context, but that if we understand speech as aimed towards truth, then that gives us a criterion for deciding when it should be limited and when shouldn't. It just so happens that I think it does, if you think of speech that way, it doesn't warrant many limits. So that's why I end up on the side of pro-free speech. Doesn't mean that I think anybody should be able to say anything at any time, but that on the particular issues that people debate nowadays, I tend to think that person should have been allowed to say that. Whereas my opponents in these discussions typically think, no, that person shouldn't have been allowed to say that.
Thank you.
My pleasure. It's a good question.
Dr. Swindal, did you have anything to say to it, or would you like to move on to the next question?
No, I think that was the spirit of Dr. Miller's claims throughout. It wasn't an absolute thing. But it's interesting, Joe, that you bring up the constitutionality, which is again political. And I would think that in every single one of those court cases, there was opposition to it. Maybe not, I'm not talking about the specifics, but in a democracy, it's interesting that there's probably still free speech advocates that would disagree with those court cases, obviously.
Thank you. So Alejandro had a question.
Yes. So.
Yeah, Alejandro, can we see your face?
Okay.
Nice.
Not right now. I have to kind of set up my phone, but after I ask the question, I'll set it up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, don't
have
worry
a webcam.
Okay.
So Dr. Miller made the argument that free speech depends on how you think about it, and you kind of choose how to deal with what's going on. And then Dr. Swindal spoke about actions as a conclusion to deliberation, such that we have a kind of responsibility to give truth, or quote unquote truths, that will not make those actions as a conclusion to the truths we give to be something, let's say, undesirable. Doesn't that imply that people should be spoon-fed? When we think about what Dr. Swindal termed problematic cases, if somebody finds a case of speech problematic or is provoked to, let's say, untoward actions by that speech, isn't that indicative of that individual's lack of temperance? Why should that person be given any bearing in academic thought when they are clearly not able to think rationally? I'm kind of trying to adopt a technocratic position about speech, as it may. So what are your thoughts on that? Why should we care if somebody without temperance finds our speech problematic or our speech leads them to do things, right? It would be like, it's a very stupid analogy, but kind of like blaming Nietzsche for the Nazis.
Yeah, I'll go first. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was directed to you. I have lots to say about that, but he directed it towards you.
Yeah, sorry, it was kind of at both, because you both said things that kind of went back and forth on this line.
I'll go first and
Sure.
just, okay. Even in the university, okay, spoon-fed does seem to be a danger, right? To restrict free speech because we're restricting somebody forming bad premises on the basis of that, right? It's kind of seems adolescent. There's a point at which you have to give adults the space to make up their own minds. They're not going to be harmed that much by a bad premise that's expressed through a free speech action. I get that. But it's amazing that, I can't, as a professor in a university, I don't think, give a lecture that's simply on the denying the Holocaust. I could say, look, my students, they're going to make up their own minds, but I'm going to give them all these quasi-facts, these unproven assumptions about the fact that the Holocaust never existed. Now that's an extreme example, but philosophers often live on somewhat extreme conditions, I would think, in which we do, push the boundaries between provable things and unprovable things, which is then feeds into the problem of the truth or not truth of an act of speech. I get that, but I think there's, my thing is that interpersonally we have a strong responsibility to report the world as it is to us as best we can with our own limitations. And all of us are in things that can be falsified. We have beliefs that can be falsified. They just haven't been falsified yet. So if I think they're true and I believe them when I say them, is that falsehood? Well, the whole point there, I think, is that you have to have some kind of objective way of determining truth, which is kind of self-referentially problematic because everybody who's forming discursive procedures about deciding truths will themselves have a lack of total truth about everything they believe. So I realize that there's difficulties with that. But so my point is rather more modest and abstract, just that speech has this unique thing about rationally giving us content to other people about the way the world is, and then if it's false, then that's not speech that I will defend.
My answer to Alejandro's question is, I think, sympathetic to the question. I'll just repeat that little quick theory I gave about the ways in which I think we take in words, that we have mental containers and that we can examine them for both meaning and truth before we open the box and let them into our lives, so to speak, into the rest of our soul. I didn't say, but I should have, that doesn't come with birth. In other words, we're not born with that ability. We don't have mental containers when we're 2 or 3 or 5 or 8 even. They develop with a proper education. And so if somebody comes into a college classroom and isn't able to do that, that's going to be a problem. If somebody receives words as if they were being physically hit in the face, that's not a critique of the professor for saying those words necessarily. It's, in many cases, I think, a critique of the student for not having developed sufficient mental containers. And that's a fault, not of the student per se, but of the educational system that has brought that student to that point.
Thank you. Jonathan, you had a question?
Yeah, so I had 2 pretty straight to the point questions. One, you guys brought up like physical action and speech. I would say they are both a physical action, but in this case, if you were to like punch yourself in, or someone punches someone else in the face, for the example that you guys used, I would say that's more of an attack, not really an action, because you can do an action that's not violent or that's violent. When it's an attack, it's straight up only violent. My second thing would also be, when it comes to hate speech, you have to define it. Is it things that people don't like hearing, or is it anything that's like hurting someone's feelings, or is it like explicitly derogatory towards someone specifically, because you have to risk hurting people's feelings to actually ask the real, you have to really define what that is, because you do have to risk that hurting other people's feelings to actually have any debate or discourse between viewpoints.
Can I answer the first, and then Jim, you can answer the second? Okay, that's a good point. That's not all physical actions are violent. And I welcome that, because my point really didn't depend on violence. It just depended on the nature of physical action. So, and you can see this in the piece I wrote called Speech, Truth, and Power, which is in one of the links on the side. But Gorgias, when he talks about speech in that speech, he thinks that it's like a drug. So drugs don't have to be violent. After all, your physician can give you a drug in your interest, not to hurt you, but to help you. But that would be a violation if you didn't agree to receive that drug. And there would be certain circumstances where it would be okay if you hadn't agreed, because you were unconscious and you would die otherwise and so on. But in normal circumstances, at least in a liberal society, we think you have a certain right to bodily integrity. And if somebody puts a substance into it that is going to change your chemistry, then you have a right to decide whether to accept that or not. Gorgias thought words are just like drugs, so that when I'm speaking, sound is going out of my mouth into my computer, through the internet, and then out of your speaker, and then going into your ears, and it's just like I've poured a drug into your soul. So he thinks that there's no significant difference between words and drugs. They're all actions. And I think that's the best argument against free speech. I mean, I think that's the Fish argument, roughly, that if speech is like a drug, yeah, we better control it. We better not let anybody pour any drug into any person. And in fact, in my essay, Speech, Truth, and Power, I say a much better example even is a virus. If speech is like a virus, well, we're all familiar now with what happens when you don't control viruses. they spread very quickly, and people who haven't consented to have the virus into their body get the virus into their body and get hurt and die. So if speech is like a physical hit or a drug or especially a virus, then the critique of free speech, the rigorous critique that says we should limit it in all these ways because otherwise people get harmed, that makes perfect sense. I just think it's based on the false premise. I don't think that speech is anything like a virus, a drug, or a physical hit.
Speech as pharmacon, right? That's
yeah.
Okay. I do think that speech is a little more, has a little bit more than drug-like quality. Drug in this sense that this, well, again, it depends on who's saying it.
Yes.
Or toxic if someone that you respect is speaking in a certain way about something, and then you're having to form conclusions about it. So in that sense, but it's a metaphor, which is limited as a metaphor, but it is a good valences. It can be very rare or very common, very severe, or very innocent as an effect. Jonathan, to your point, one distinction I didn't make when I was talking about actions, and let's say violent actions, is whether or not they're human actions. In other words, if you do something just instinctual, that's a violent action, that even a court of law will think that's quite different than a very carefully planned, deliberating upon action, right? That's just human nature to say. Sometimes we just act before we think, which is different than acting after we have thought carefully. I'm saying let's hold speech to the standard of the careful need that we all have to deliberate, to act as human beings, as not just instinctual creatures, which we are, but as the human being creatures that we are. And that's where the free speech responsibility gets its restrictions when falsehoods are part of that. I'm just making that distinction of action that's instinctual versus action that's deliberative. Now, the thing you said about hate speech is also interesting, because we have to, you're saying we have to recognize that people have a certain feeling about hate speech that's kind of pre-rational and understandable. And we can't assume, as we do in the academy, I think, that we're all kind of mature enough that we get over that kind of initial felt reaction to things, at least quickly, and then we can think about it. The way things actually are, even in the academy, though, is not only not that way, but I think it's getting more towards when you have restrictions in syllabi or warnings in syllabi that some of the speech here might be problematic for people and they have a right to exempt themselves from situations, trigger warnings, kinds of things. So you raise a really good point there, which puts burden on my side of the argument, because I'm going to have to think about when, as I think you're implying, Jonathan, you got to get over it, right? There's certain feelings, you just got to get over them at a certain point, and that's only rational for me as a speaker to know there's a certain part of you that I can kind of obligate to get over your initial feelings about some of my speech. So I get that. Again, I punted on the whole problem of how these restrictions would happen at the end of the paper. So.
Does anybody else have any other questions to ask?
Can I ask a clarification question to Dr. Swindal? I was just wondering if you could clarify your argument that deals with the possibility of speech being false. I wasn't really following you. It seemed to me that you were saying that restrictions on speech would eliminate the possibility of spoken falsehoods or lying, which I couldn't see like how you were drawing that conclusion
That's an excellent question. While I was reading it, I'm thinking, gosh, I didn't really explain that very well, so I really appreciate your question. It's a bigger question. Actually, it starts with Donald Davidson, who believes that all of our beliefs are basically true. All right? So in the reservoir of all of our beliefs, they might be in a certain way false because we haven't been through something, but from our perspectival commitment to beliefs, they're all pretty much true. But if they were all true, this is kind of a leap. Your name's Nathaniel? Nathaniel, right? If they were all true, this is weird, what would there be to talk about? It seems to me, and this is Davidson's kind of upshot, is that we engage in speech because we aren't sure of the truth of things. And that's kind of weird because a lot of speech is just kind of, oh, isn't that beautiful? And gosh, I had some for breakfast today and I'm not feeling too well. But it's a larger point that truth and falsity are so much part of speech that it's the assumption that there could be falsehood that really makes speech necessary. Because you're trying to build a conclusion, and if you knew everything was true just as uttered, you'd never have to build it to a conclusion. It would be taken simply by its sheer immediacy. So speech would just be reporting your beliefs or feelings. Period. There would be no. You would have talking going on, but there wouldn't be any telos in this speech other than just reporting what cannot be false. That's why falsehood is so important. It's so important as a presupposition for what speech is about, and therefore the reverse side of that is that speech is about trying to get over falsehoods, even if they aren't false, but they could be false. That's
seems to me an argument for free speech, but I don't know. Maybe I'm again misunderstanding.
By the way, Dr. Swindal left. There was a technical issue.
I'm sure it was an accident.
I'm sure he'll rejoin here in a second.
He got triggered.
I don't know if we should just, I assume we should just wait a moment to see if he returns.
Or if somebody has a question for me, I can try to answer. And then if he comes back, I'll just stop. But if anyone has a question just for me, now would be the time.
I guess, but the question would probably be more for both of you. Okay. It's just, I spoke about temperance earlier, and there's this kind of back and forth about people making up their own minds. I guess both sides, even for and against free speech, are kind of assuming people are rational or at least intelligent enough to formulate proper thoughts, as if had they been trained at school, they could be able to do that, as if it was just a matter of training. I don't want to speak of indoctrination. I'm being like, they were lucky enough to have some kind of training in critical thinking or whatever. But how is that in any way evident? And I guess the part of the question that would be for Dr. Swindal, but I would like to hear your thoughts about it, are how does any kind of duty from those of us who are trained, or who try to be trained at least, follow at all? I mean, why should we contemplate, let's say, putting up with the illiterate? I know it's a harsh way to put it, but I just lack better words and I'm lazy.
Okay. Can you summarize? So there's that last question with complete, I thought it was going in one direction.
No, it is related in both ways, but yeah. So how is it legitimate to assume that even with proper education, people are intelligent enough to draw their own conclusions, if whatever we say draws to that? And as kind of a corollary to that, why should we, let's say, water down our speech and kind of look out for the opinions of the illiterate at all?
Okay, I'll just take the first one, which is more fundamental, which is why should we assume that people are rational enough to have free speech? I'm not speaking about all of humanity, but rather, hi Jim, I'm just answering Alejandro's question, and you can give it a try, you can try it again. My argument was about us here now. In other words, I'm not trying to say free speech is possible for everybody all the time, but that if we're having a real debate, then it has to be given us as a right. Otherwise, it's not a real debate. But of course, I left open, I hope that was noticed, I left open, maybe we're not having a real debate. Maybe it's just a disputation, maybe I'm just showing off, maybe Dr. Swindal wants to humiliate me, whatever. But if it's a real debate, then we have to be given freedom to speak as we understand our pursuit of the truth. So that if I have certain arguments that I want to make for my case, there can't be restrictions such that I can't make those arguments. Otherwise, it's not a real debate.
Right, so we agree fundamentally that truth is just for fellow technicians, that we should not contemplate, let's say, those I fondly call the illiterates.
I'm not sure what you mean by technician.
Trained people, or at least people with sufficient knowledge to be a part of the conversation.
So I would say yes, except that I think you and I might disagree about what training is. And I certainly said something about school. I think school can help a bit, but I think the training that I'm most concerned with is more about emotional maturity. In other words, does someone have the ability, for example, to hear an insult and not retaliate, but just take it into their mind and say, all right, well, so-and-so tried to insult me. That doesn't mean that I have to feel insulted. Some kids are able to achieve that in the schoolyard, not because of what they're learning in class, but just because they have it by nature, or they have parents who instill those kind of skills in them. So Jim, Alejandro asked, we didn't know what to do while you were gone. So Alejandro asked a new question, but you were also in the midst of answering somebody else's question. So I'll leave it up to you. Muted.
Sorry, Alejandro or Nathaniel, my screen went completely blank. I don't know why that did. But actually, I was pretty much at the end of my thing there about falsehood. But did you have any follow-up on that, Nathaniel? Sorry about that.
No, we can just proceed. It's fine. Thank you for answering the question.
Okay, so Alejandro, thank you. That was a great question, by the way. Alejandro, what was your and Dr. Miller's prompting there?
Right, so Dr. Miller kind of mentioned something that changes the question a little bit, because Dr. Miller made the argument that proper education or training is kind of necessary to formulate a proper debate, but Dr. Miller sees it more in terms of emotional maturity, and I see it more in terms of technical training. But regardless, how can you assume that even with proper training or schooling or whatever, a person can be intelligent enough to actually have, a bearing in any kind of debate? That is to say, why should we waste our time watering down our speech and looking out for the feelings of people who lack that emotional maturity and temperance, or who are not literate enough to actually contribute to a debate?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole point, yeah, got that. But the whole point is that truth can hurt.
So
I don't, in a way, have to worry about people who are going to be, according to my definition, truth might seem false to someone that I'm saying it to, and it might hurt the person I'm saying it to, but for me, that's no way to restrict free speech at all. That's not the issue. But it takes a trust in somehow a transcendent source of truth, I would imagine. I'd have to go that far to say that that's the only person that we're answerable to. And even if our speech is therefore misunderstood by people who aren't mature enough, let's say, to understand it, that for me is not going to damage them.
But Dr. Swindal, you think that a Holocaust denier should not be given any public platform, right?
Yes, yes.
So why not?
Because he is really he is threatening the very possibility of speech at all. Because I'm saying that speech presumes a distinction between truth and falsehood, and is a way of looking towards just one of those two, namely truth. And it would seem to me very hard for someone to be in a society where we do have connections with that one, where we do have to regulate someone's speaking of things that are false.
So
But
we should take the Holocaust as this complete unquestioned truth. I'm not a denier. I'm just finding that idea rather disturbing, that there should be truths in our society and communication that we need to accept blindly.
fill in the blanks. Okay. If I say, you know, and I'm talking to someone on the phone, that I'm 6'5", right? That's just the same as denying the Holocaust, I mean, in a sense. Do I have the freedom to do that? Well, then the word freedom doesn't really apply. Am I misusing speech because I'm basically ignoring the distinction between truth and falsehood? Yes. And I'm violating other people's right to have my speaking what I understand to be true, and also the obligation for the social power people to correct me when what I've said thinking it's true is false.
Here's where I think your move of the question from politics to morality matters, because I think we'll all say, well, there's something wrong with somebody saying they're 6'5" when they're not, just like there's something wrong with someone denying the Holocaust. So that it's like there's a mound in my backyard and there's Mount Everest, and they're kind of the same, but they're very different. But at any rate,
Fair enough on that analogy.
they're both morally bad. But then there's the political question of whether people should be allowed to do morally bad things. And I think they should. Maybe not all morally bad things, but some morally bad things. And when it comes to speech, a lot of morally bad things, because the alternative is to have the government tell us which things are true and which things aren't. And sure, the Holocaust happened. And when the denier gets up, any reasonable person knows that this person's going to be either lying or completely self-deceived. But I've just seen too many times reasonable positions be excluded from so-called reasonable debate because they're considered false and they don't deserve a hearing. And that just seems to me, well, it's unfair, and it violates the pursuit of truth. Because after all, interesting truths usually meet a lot of resistance before they're accepted, and that policy would stagnate human inquiry.
That's one of the things that you were bringing up, right? It takes time to even get there socially with the truth, and we have to wait until we're at that level to tolerate some of the truth that could come out. But my thing is that the politics, we lock up people for their actions, so why is speech such an exception? Now, again, actions are at the conclusion of premises. It's deliberative action that gets people locked up, right? You have to make conclusions to commit a crime in the full sense of the crime. We lock them up. So why aren't we locking up people who, even if they're not fully aware of it, giving people information by which they make conclusions, which sometimes the actions of which we will lock up?
I would say that the people who act on false premises, it's their fault, not the speaker of the premise maker. And then the additional political question, which is, I don't want the government deciding which premises, philosophical premises especially, are true and which are false.
But they are, because they're using true premises to make conclusions about who they're going to lock up for their actions. I mean, that's a deliberative process too. So the premises are really serious, because that's the one thing that we have to generate conclusions that generate rational action. So if we're locking them up for the end of the story, why, if someone had all premises that were given to them that were false, false speech, we say leniency? Of course, a lot of it does happen in courts. I agree. That in courts, you look at why the murderer did what he did, and then you look at the premises that were formed. And if he were under the, let's say in a in a cult, we would excuse that action maybe more because the premises formed by the false speech of the cult, let's say, would reduce the blame for the action and therefore the punishment. I get that. Although I think the Manson people are still in jail, so, but that's another issue. Mine is just more kind of a weird kind of a moral metaphysical argument about the nature of speech. That speech has got this truth falsity thing is fundamental to it. And it's a performative contradiction to mess around with it.
Well, coming up to 5:30, should we take one more question?
Sure. I saw Jonathan said he had another question, but it looks like he's stepped off screen, though I think he might have wireless headphones. So I don't know if he's going to come running back, being able to hear me.
Somebody else then?
I actually have a question. So I wonder if there might be a case that the situation nowadays towards free speech, the landscape has really changed. I mean, you talked about how Gorgias's idea of speech being a drug and how you disagree with that. But I think there's a lot of proof almost to the contrary, in just taking into consideration social media and the massive impact that it's had on individuals and especially on discourse. And what role that plays. And also additionally, and I think that might affect the ability to have these conversations, but I also wonder if, sort of throwing back to some of Alejandro's points, if there's also a case to be made, this is more, I wonder if there's a case to be made for the failure of, say, lower institutions in educating students, so in high school, and so by the point that students are getting into university, they're not prepared for the sort of discourse that is expected by the professors. And if so, in a way, I think that might explain their perspective towards free speech and demanding sort of a paternalistic approach from the university towards it. But I think I wonder specifically about the impact that social media and in the changing landscape of discourse, how that impacts free speech.
Yeah, that's a great point about social media. Have you seen this Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma?
I just heard about it today from Sam Harris's podcast.
Yeah, well, it makes points that you're probably already familiar with, that Silicon Valley for at least a decade has been designing these apps and social media to hack our brains, to capitalize on our attention constantly. And it's having devastating consequences on our society. So I think that's roughly right. And I also think there's a psychological point to be made about this notion of mental containers that I've mentioned, that I haven't developed really in a separate piece, but that I want to. That developing those, I've said to Alejandro, it takes emotional maturity, maybe a certain kind of parenting. School can help, but if one never has any time to oneself, or that whenever one's by oneself, one is furtively, constantly checking social media, I don't think those mental containers are going to develop. I just don't think there'll be a real sense of boundaries between oneself and one's social sphere, because anytime one's alone, the social sphere is impinging upon you. So I guess I want to agree with you that the landscape of discourse is changing. And you could take, if that's true, and my argument were true, you could take two routes. You could say, all right, the landscape is changing, free speech is no longer possible, so let's go along with restrictions so that people, don't get triggered. Another would be, let's fight as hard as we can against these social forces that are making it such that people aren't developing mental containers, so that we can hold on to this precious ideal of free speech. That's clearly the route that I prefer, but it may be futile. Just like the fight for liberal democracy might be futile. It's not clear that it's going to last.
But yeah, what comes in is, okay, what happens when someone comes to college? Let's stay with the university and they've been ill prepared, let's say. What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to then just do kind of remedial, getting them up to where they should be by just telling them all just very, very evident truths that they just never were exposed to? And it seems to me that the answer there is no. That the elenchus, the dialectics have to be there in the university. And you weren't challenging this, Daniel, obviously, but they really have to be there from day one. So kind of where you do take a risk on somebody not being prepared for the oppositions. And that's what we do in philosophy. You present two different sides. It's the same, Patrick, this is everything we're talking about here. It's the dialectics start on day one in university and they continue throughout. And those who are ill prepared for them, I don't know how to deal with that, but I do know that to be true to ourselves, that's just what we have to do. And hope that with time, the elenchus and the disputations and the dialectic will help out. And that's why it's interesting how Fish is so weird about this one part of his argument where, well, Milton actually, Fish is reporting it, where the Catholic Church is the very thing that enshrined the devil's advocate, right? For Milton, as Fish is reporting. And yet, that's part of popery and superstition of the church. And so I think the church having this weird kind of strong commitment to point counterpoint, and yet has often been accused of not using that with regard to certain things that it does itself. We'll go into what those are, but I just think it's very interesting in the Catholic University in particular to deal with this fact that people who aren't quite ready for what seems to them a falsehood in the counterposition, like if you talk about God and talk about atheism, some people say that's the atheism is false, don't you think? You're not an atheist, teacher. Why are you talking to me about atheism? So those things, I think, are somewhat unique, not just in Catholicism, but very much part of Catholicism. As Milton pointed out, and still criticizes Catholicism.
I have to go pretty soon, but Jonathan, it was said that you had one more question.
Yeah. So there were two small questions. One, you guys were talking about morals in terms of freedom of speech, and I wanted to ask, who defines the morals? Because whoever defines it can like twist it in a way to help it make their point more valid. My other thing would be more of like the libertarian standpoint is I think you should be able to say anything you want, but you have to live with the consequences along with the one caveat of if you are inciting violence, like physical violence, or you are calling to action for someone else to commit a violent act, that should not be allowed, but everything else should be. Even if it's something you don't like, it should be allowed to be said so that you can have a discourse over whatever the topic is.
I'll take that first, Jonathan. You're my student here, so the first thing is that who decides morality? Well, you seem to imply it's conventional, right? And I don't think morality is simply a conventional creation. It's got to have some kind of source in reason, and reason has to have some kind of source in something. I might try to be Greek here for a moment, Dr. Miller, something divine. But that would be a whole other story. But I'm saying that when I'm using the term moral, I don't see it as a conventional thing. It's got to have some kind of grounding, particularly in reason. But your point is well taken, is that who does decide that? I mean, I'm giving you parameters for the answer. I'm not telling you that it's God because I don't believe in divine command theory, but as such. But there are alternatives to it's the majority thing, sort of a powerful thing. It's okay. think about the speech. You're giving kind of a libertarian thing, which I think is not going to quite work for certainly for my argument. I don't say just let the chips fall, because people can get hurt when the chips are falling from hate speech and so forth. You're taking, I think, a kind of a high ground of let people be responsible. Life is hard and so forth. So I see your point, but I do think at that point it can be more reasonable for society to protect certain people from the free actions of others, because I define free speech as also free expression, which involves images that I use freely as my speech. And those can be very harmful, especially when I use images of you. Okay, I'm saying that's my free speech. I took an anonymous picture of Jonathan. No, that's an image it's public. I have the right to express it, but I think there needs to be, limitations. Good questions.
Dr. Miller, if you'd like to answer that question out loud, you can feel free to.
Oh, the question that Sophia asked? Yeah, well, I don't have an answer. I accept a negative one, which is I don't think that kind of education is possible in a university. I just don't think the way universities are designed allow.
Can you give a question?
Yeah, in the chat, and she's asking me, how do I think that people can be educated emotionally in the way that I was alluding to, such that they can develop the ability for free speech?
Good.
As a lot of it comes through life experiences, meditation, and so on, and I agree with that. How can we instill the sort of stoic emotional maturity in more people from an earlier age? So I've given two negative answers, namely, it's almost too late really by the time people are at university, and also even if it weren't too late, just the way the university is designed, there's no way you're going to get an emotional education from professors or even one professor. It's just, unless you take 10 classes with a person, and because emotional education requires a close relationship that just university just doesn't allow. The other negative answer I gave is that certainly social media is not giving it, and probably depriving many people of achieving it. But the positive answer, that's like asking me how to be a good parent. I don't think there's a formula.
But I do think it's all about reason, and how the more we educate about reason, what reasoning is, it's kind of a sacred thing. And that's how I think a lot of our emotional growth comes from learning certain forms of reason.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm hearing an echo myself. I think courage is really important, and that getting an education in courage, think about going to university to get an education in courage. I think that makes clear why I think that it's just not possible here, but that there are other places where one can get an education in courage. The martial arts, for example.
I think it takes courage to stand in front of a classroom with Duquesne students every day I'm in there.
That's true. Yeah.
I'm serious about that. It's a great responsibility to have to know that emotional experiences are there that you have no idea about in students, and you have to find a way to keep it moving, as it were. And that's a challenge to all teachers.
Well, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you to Dr. Miller and Dr. Swindal, both of you, for coming out and participating in this debate, and also to everybody else who came here and watched and asked questions. I think it was a really great event, and we talked about a lot of really important things.
Good, and thanks Dr. Miller again for being kind of the impetus on the faculty side here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And if you like these debates, there's going to be one in October between me and Dr. Lampert on the question of, is technology good? He chose that it is, so I have to argue that it's not, which is something I'm starting to come to believe. and especially when it comes to social media, as is clear from what I said earlier. And then in November, the question is democracy good? And my opponent that time will be Dr. Vogelstein, and he has chosen to argue that democracy is bad. And we're going to try and have it a day or two before the election, I think. And I'm going to have to argue that democracy is good, which again is something I think, so that's fine.
Good.
Yeah, and if anybody is interested in staying up to date on those events and any other events that we'll be hosting, I'll post a link in the chat, and you can follow us on any of our social media or join our mailing list, and we'll be sure to let everybody know as soon as these events are coming up. So yeah, thank you for everybody coming.